Okay, thank you very much. It's great to see you all. I hope you can hear me.
Yes.
Okay,
Well.
good. It's an honor to introduce Dennis Leech to this distinguished audience. Dennis is a professor of emeritus of economics at University of Warwick. He became affiliated with this university for about half a century ago. His other affiliations include Center for Philosophy of Natural and Social Science at London School of Economics. He is a very prolific author, specializing in several areas of economics and related disciplines. One of his main interests is and has been the design of economic institutions and, more specifically, the distribution of control over the outcomes ensuing from those institutions. This work continues the voting power approach pioneered by Lionel Penrose, Lloyd Shapley, Martin Shubig, and John Banzhaf, as I think most of this audience knows. This field of study originated in a decade following the Second World War as a byproduct of the search for solutions in n-person cooperative games, and would probably have remained of interest to the game theorists only had it not become obvious to some economists, political scientists, and lawyers that the distribution of a priori power in voting bodies is not, at least not trivially, identical with the distribution of resources, such as votes or shares of stock, among the actors in those bodies. Rather, the influence over the outcome seems to depend on the decision-making rules as well. This is no doubt the primary upshot of the power index research. Since the resources, such as votes, are typically assumed to be exogenously given, the designers can, by fiddling with the decision rules, bring about changes in expected outcomes akin to those obtained by redistributing the resources of actors, at least to some extent. The institutions of the European Union, the Council of Ministers in particular, provided an excellent testbed for various measures of a priori voting power. Dennis has made significant contributions to these studies, not only through his results on specific institutions, but also through his work on algorithms for computing power distributions in institutions consisting of ever larger number of actors. A few years ago, Dennis devised with his son Robert a most useful resource and tool for the scholarly community, namely an open access site for voting power analysis. It may still today be the largest of its kind in the world. Lest I leave you with the impression that a priori voting power indices are Dennis's only major research field, let me remind you of his long-term interest in evaluating economic policies, policy proposals, pension systems, retail price indices, and monetary theory. His list of scholarly publications is long, including entries representing a variety of academic disciplines. His favorite outlet thus far seems to be Public Choice, where he has published at least half a dozen articles. Dennis is also an active participant in public debates, especially on pension systems, electoral reforms, the economic effects of the current pandemic, the economic and power implications of Brexit, and so on. Dennis has extended the voting power analysis to old and new influential financial institutions, such as International Monetary Fund. Indeed, the title of Dennis's presentation of today suggests that we are next going to hear his results on yet another important financial institution. Dennis, I warmly welcome you. The floor is now yours.
Thank you very much, Hannu. That was very kind of you. I got into voting power through studying corporate control. Essentially, it was looking at control of companies through voting by shareholders. And I want to see everyone. Sorry. Yes. Okay. And I discovered this by accident, really, this field. I sort of invented a kind of voting power measure, which I subsequently discovered was a bit like the Penrose index. And I discovered there was a whole literature on it, which I didn't know anything about. And I discovered that the work I'd done was somewhat similar to the literature. And but I found the literature rather unsatisfactory because it was very difficult to calculate the indices. Calculating voting power indices for a voting body with even a moderate number of, even quite a small number of voters is a major problem, and it hadn't really been addressed. And so I decided to commit myself to trying to solve that problem, and I succeeded to an extent, and with my son, who was a PhD student at the time, who knew a lot more about using computers than I did. We set up a website which is still available if anybody is interested in doing these calculations that I'm going to talk about today. I don't want so my concern really was that a lot of the research on voting power was being held back by the inability to really calculate power indices, Shapley-Shubik indices, and Banzhaf indices, and so on. So I tried to address that problem. So it's within that sort of framework that I'm going to talk about this study today, really. I'm, in a sense, it's a fairly limited objective. I'm not going to pretend that there are no methodological problems with voting power indices, certainly not the a priori very simple ones that I'm going to use. However, I think it's useful to calculate them and to analyze them, and to as part of a wider horizon, spreading exercise, as it were. The reason I did this study was because I was approached by the Inter-American Development Bank with a proposal to do it. So it's quite interesting that they actually asked me to do a piece of consultancy work, a study sponsored by them as part of their review of governance that they were doing. And I wouldn't have done it otherwise. Really, other people have done voting power analyses, notably Professor Strand, who recommended me. So that's how I got into it. It's not that I'm going out looking for weighted voting bodies to analyse. I think I've done it. I've done several of those. I'll just say, by the way, that my principal research at the moment, my principal academic activity is within the university pension scheme. There is a tremendous debate going on about the future of the University of Warwick, the university superannuation scheme in the UK, which is a private scheme and is being treated under legislation that is intended for private companies. So that takes up a lot of my time. Anyway, I sent the paper to Florian. I wonder if it's possible to show it now. The Inter-American Development Bank is part of the Bretton Woods system. Essentially, it's a regional development bank by development finance for Latin America and the Caribbean. Its headquarters in Washington. It has 48 member countries, 26 of them in Latin America and the Caribbean, and there are 22 borrowing countries. I've listed them because they're perhaps of some interest. Could you scroll down? Could you show the whole page? No. Okay. So the non-borrowing, so the 26 so-called borrowing countries and 22 non-borrowing countries, including 2 regional non-borrowing countries, USA and Canada, and then an assortment of countries, some of which are a little bit surprising, really. But there's 16 European countries, including some of former Yugoslavia, and then the non-borrowing countries include several Asian countries, Japan, and the People's Republic of China, as well as Israel. Anyway, we don't need to worry about the history of the organization. It was founded in the 1950s, I think, and oh yes, one interesting thing about the bank is that the borrowing countries have slightly more than 50% of the votes on the board. They have a majority, which is rather unusual for the borrowers to have a majority of votes on the bank. Could you put the next page up? A bit more, thank you. Right, so obviously it's like a joint stock company in a way. Shareholders, all these member countries are shareholders, and they use weighted voting. You know, and the United States is obviously the biggest shareholder with 30% of the votes. So it's a massively dominant in that sense. But we will analyze it and see what happens. See what comes out of the analysis. There are 2 boards, 2 governing bodies. There's the Board of Governors, which consists of all the members, and you can see there various voting decision rules that it uses. So for ordinary decisions, it's half the voting weight, simple majority, but then for special decisions of a more fundamental nature, they have very special rules, like to increase the ordinary share capital, for example, it's the voting threshold is 3/4 of the voting weight, plus 33 votes, plus of which 19 are regional countries, and so on. The election of president, half the voting weight, but with 15 countries, 15 regional countries, and so on. So there are various rules, not all of which we're going to be able to analyze because of, I'm afraid, it hasn't been possible to develop the suitable algorithms to do that, given these combined majority rules. Then the Board of Executive Directors is 14, the so-called chairs, and there are 14 members, 11 regional members and 3 non-regional members, and they vote entirely by voting weight. They make ordinary decisions by a simple majority, half the voting weight. And I'm ignoring the quorum, as we tend to do in voting power analysis. Okay, so I'm going to talk about the Board of Governors and the Board of Executive Directors, and then talk about how the Executive Directors conceivably make their decisions now they're elected as well. So could I have the next page, please? Right, so these are the constituencies from which the executive board members are elected. So I've labelled them C1 to C14, and these are the countries which at the moment belong to these constituencies. The first one is USA, and the second one is Argentina and Haiti, Brazil, Suriname, and so on. They're fairly straightforward. Dominican Republic, Mexico, and then we have a much bigger constituency, which includes C5, which includes Croatia, Japan, Korea, and the UK. And C5 is actually completely dominated by Japan. Japan has a majority of the votes in that constituency. And so on. We'll talk more about the constituencies in a minute. Okay, there's one here, C6, which is mainly European countries with China and Israel. C7 is entirely European countries. And then the others are the Latin American countries. Or C9 is just Canada. And then the last two are, well, the Central American constituency, and then the British Caribbean constituency, Bahamas, Barbados, etc. Okay, so we'll analyze these in turn as need be, although I think only 5 of them are really interesting from a voting point of view. Next slide, please. Thank you. Okay, now this slide, an interesting thing is about the governance of the IADB is how the constituencies, the status of the constituencies, how the constituencies are formed, because they don't exist in the rules. They're not formal at all. They are real. They're a very important part of the way in which the bank works. In the same way that with the IMF, the constituencies are extremely important, but they don't exist in the rules. They're entirely informal, but very important. So what the rules do say is that they lay down procedures for electing executive directors. They're extremely prescriptive procedures, and they give the impression of having been written in such a way as to produce the constituencies. All the people who vote for a director, all the countries which vote for a director are giving their votes to that director. So the directors vote en bloc. So the first constituency in the rules, it says something like this. It says 2 candidates each receive no fewer votes than the sum of the voting weight of the country with the largest voting weight, which happens to be Argentina or Brazil. They've both got the same voting weight of about 11%. And the country with the least voting weight, which we know is Suriname. So that's a rather bizarre rule in my opinion, but anyway, that's what it says in the constitution. And then there's another one, so that's 2 candidates. So that basically delivers the first 2 directors to Argentina and Brazil in practice. And then with the votes of Suriname. And then there's a candidate from Mexico defined by this. Actually, sorry, it's not the votes of Suriname. Excuse me, it's whoever voted for them. I think it's Argentina, and I can't remember them. We'll see that in a minute. But I mean, it's whoever voted for them anyway. This is a rule rather than an outcome of the voting. And so we get all these rules, and they actually deliver Argentina, Brazil, Mexico, Venezuela, Chile, and Colombia as the first 6 directors on the board from Latin America. So I mean, that's an interesting thing, because it raises the question: are the constituencies endogenous or exogenous? And I mean, for the analysis, we have to treat them as exogenous, but possibly that's questionable. I don't know. Anyway, I thought that I would put that in just to make it clear what the constituencies are. Next slide, please. Right, I don't know whether I need to say a lot about this. These are the power indices employed in this study when we analysed the voting power in the board of directors. They're the straightforward I power indices. I think that's the I power is the term used by Felsenthal and Makova, I think. So the I don't think I need to go into that actually at this stage. I might come back to it later if need be. But essentially, it's the Penrose index, which is the probability of or the absolute Banzhaf index, probability of a swing, and then the Banzhaf index is the normalized version of the Penrose index, so it sums to 1 over the entire electorate. And then I've also got the Coleman's indices, the power to prevent action and the power to initiate action, which I think are useful for analysing supermajority situations. So basically, I'm going to use the Penrose index as a probability, which is just simply as a raw probability based on the I power model and the Banzhaf index to measure to compare distributions of votes with distributions of power. Next one, please. Right, so this is the first bit of data. You can see here this is the Board of Governors, so this is all 48 countries. The blue ones are the non-borrowing countries, and the green ones are the borrowing countries. So you can see if you look down the first column, the United States has got 30% of the votes. So it's a very similar situation to in the IMF and World Bank. It's got yeah, okay, it's 30% of the votes. And Argentina and Brazil with 11% each. Mexico with 7.3%, and then Japan with 5%. So Japan has quite a large stake, and then Canada 4%, and so on. Then the sort of second ranking Latin American countries: Venezuela, Chile, Colombia, and then we get the European countries coming in. I think UK is just under 1% there. So that's the distribution of weighted votes. They tend to be called voting power in the literature, voting powers, but they're not voting powers really, because in order to say, talk about power, we have to consider outcomes, the effectiveness of voting. So there are two analyses then, and if you look at the second pair of columns, then we see that there's a majority quota, 50%, majority decision rule, simple majority. So basically, I've just done the ordinary decision analysis for ordinary decisions taken by the Board of Governors. But I have nothing to say in this analysis about other kinds of decisions which require both voting, both weighted voting and also numbers of votes, and also composition of votes from the two different groups of countries. So we get a very similar. So the analysis here in the second and third column are very similar to the analysis I did years ago of the IMF and World Bank. The United States has a lot more voting power than anybody else. It's an extremely unequal distribution, but there's only one very large voter with a concentrated vote, and this effect of that is that voting power is more unequal, even more unequal. So we get 46% of the normalized as the normalized Banzhaf index, and all the others have a smaller power index than their votes, their share of the votes. But if we look at the next analysis, the majority for supermajority decisions or special decisions, and again, it's an incomplete analysis really, because it's only looking at weighted voting. It's ignoring how many countries cast their votes, so it's ignoring part of the rule. But we see same sort of result as we got before with the IMF, that power is more equally distributed than weight. So the United States has 30% of the power of the weight of the votes, but only 16% of the voting power, and that's because a veto. The United States has a veto, of course, but it doesn't mean that it's able to initiate action. It means other countries, as a group, have a veto as well. So the United States, its power to initiate action is very limited. So these are the Coleman's indices: power to prevent action, which is of course 1 for the United States, 100% is veto, but then its power to initiate action is very small, and the distribution of power to initiate action is very equal. So I think that's an important point that people sometimes forget, that having a veto is not the same as being able to get your own way if you want to make a proposal. You can simply prevent action, but you may not be able to initiate it. But these results are fairly unsurprising, really. I think it's what we would expect. Next slide, please. Next page. Yeah, this is the bottom of the table now, and this is the small print. If you want to read about how the calculations were done, I think I used IPGen. Yes, IPGenF, I think. Yeah, one of my algorithms, generating functions, I think. Yes. So you can see that China is not very significant. The People's Republic of China has hardly any votes. Nor does Korea. And but that's yeah. If we carry on, so the next slide, please. Now here we have the analysis of the board of executive directors, which is the real decision-making body which runs the bank on a day-to-day basis. So again, the United States has 30% of the votes, and Argentina and Brazil just over 11%. But these votes, of course, are votes of constituencies. They're not just votes of countries. So some of these figures are larger. I mean, Japan, for example, has 5% of the shares of the votes, but the constituency it leads by virtue of having such a large number of votes is worth 6.1% of the executive directors. And you can see here that Germany is elected. The German director is elected by this group from Belgium, Germany, Israel, Italy, Netherlands, Switzerland. This is a much more open constituency, and so on. Now, for this analysis, I've been able to, because it's such a small voting body with only 14 members, I was able to work out the number of decisive swings for each chair for interest. Haven't had to use any approximations in doing the calculation. So anyway, if we look at the, could you move it? Could you please move it up a bit? That's it. And I can see the bottom. No, top on the bottom. Thank you. Well, okay. So we can compare the voting shares of the votes with the shares of the voting power using the Banzhaf index, and I think it's the same sort of thing. It's an unequal body that's dominated by one very large voter. So I think all the members, all the chairs have less voting power than their nominal number of votes. Okay, so shall we move on to the next one, please? And the board of directors only uses a 50% rule, so there's nothing else to analyse there. Right. So these are the constituencies. Right. So here's the one that has elected the German director. So actually Italy has more votes than Germany, but they have identical voting power, and China has 0 voting power. These are numbers of swings in that group, so they're quite small now, no decisive swings. We use the Penrose index later on for doing the probability, the two-stage probability analysis I'll talk about. So I've got pictures of these. I'll show you diagrams of these constituencies in a minute. This is the European one, entirely European countries, France and Spain. Spain actually has slightly more votes than France, slightly more voting power, but this constituency has elected France as the French director. But all the countries have some voting power. and Denmark, Norway, Austria, Finland all have the same voting power index. Denmark and Norway have the same number of votes. Austria and Finland have the same number of votes as well. So it's fairly interesting. But well, France and Spain both have less voting power. Interestingly, France has a lot less. France has got nearly 40% of the votes in that group, but only 20% of the voting power. Spain, having slightly more votes, has a lot more voting power on the Banzhaf index, because Spain participates in 40 swings, decisive swings, whereas France only has 24. And then Sweden has 20. Now Sweden does very well. Sweden has a lot fewer votes than France, but almost as much voting power. So that's a kind of interesting result, I think. So could you scroll down a bit further, please? Right, and this is the South American, one of the South American constituencies: Uruguay, Bolivia, Paraguay. They have different numbers of votes, but they all have a third of the power each. And the Central American constituency, yeah, they all have the same voting power, 20% each, apart from Belize, which has 0 voting power, although it has 11% of the votes within that constituency. And then the British Caribbean constituency, it's fairly, well, I don't think there's a lot going on there that surprises us. Really, it's fairly straightforward. Yeah, so can we move on to the next one, please? Right, okay, well, here's the graphical representation of that. So this is the first one. This is the German chair. This is elected the German chair at the last election, or last time the directors were elected. So you can see China has 0 voting power there, and Germany and Italy neck and neck. Italy slightly more votes than Germany, but because there are two of them, there's a kind of countervailing power situation. So voting power, they both have less voting power than weight, and then at the right hand side, we've got Switzerland, which has a lot more voting power than its weight. So Switzerland gains a lot. France and Germany lose within that constituency. And then so next one, please. Okay, thank you. This is the European group with France and Spain, and France loses a lot. France's voting power is a lot less than its votes. Its voting power is almost half its share of the votes, and all other countries gain from France and Spain not having as many votes, as much voting power as their votes, and Sweden does very well. So that's an interesting case, I think, which illustrates the utility of voting power analysis. At least they might do. I don't know. I mean, they elect the French. France won the election, but that's not. But France is not a dictator, so there's no reason why they should. Oh, sorry, Spain is not a dictator, so they shouldn't. No reason why France shouldn't win. Okay, next one, please. These are the 3 South American countries. You can see the country in the middle is Paraguay, which doubles its voting power, is almost double its number of votes, the share of the vote. Uruguay loses power relative to votes, and Bolivia is about the same. Bolivia's in the middle, so that's all 3 countries that have a third of the voting power each. So that's fairly typical of these kinds of relatively egalitarian constituencies. We found similar results in my work on the IMF. Okay, next one, please. This is the Central American republics, and they all have the same voting power. There's not much variation among the 5 of them, except Belize is a lot smaller, has a lot less voting weight than the others, and 0 voting power. There's no, it cannot affect a vote theoretically. Next one, please. All right, and the West Indies, British West Indies. So power is almost proportional to weight for Jamaica. Then there's redistribution, I think, from Trinidad, Barbados, and Guyana to the Bahamas. So that's a sort of fairly interesting result, I think. So anything can happen in these constituencies, really, and I think it's in these kinds of applications, really, where the application is useful. Voting power is telling us something that is possibly useful. Okay, because we're not talking about behaviour. We're just talking about a priori voting power. It's independent of preferences and independent of issues. Okay, next one, please. Right, so this is now treating the Board of Executive Directors as a representative body. So it's looking at the voting power of the members, 48 members of the bank, in terms of their ability to influence the Board of Executive Directors, but through voting. So some of them vote. I mean, some of them just appoint the director, like United States and Canada, and some of them, and so that's very straightforward. We just use the voting power that we've already calculated for the Board of Directors, but some of them have go through constituencies, but again, some of them are dictators within their constituencies. So we simply adjust the voting weights for countries like Argentina, Brazil, Mexico, Venezuela, Japan, Venezuela, Colombia, Chile. These are all dictators, I think, within their constituencies, and and so we just change the weights by adding the other constituency members, and then we do the analysis of the directors. No, we just take the voting power from the directors, but then others, we need to take into account the voting power within the constituencies. Some of them, of course, have zero voting power, like Peru. You can see, like Peru, zero voting power within their constituency. Likewise, United Kingdom, and the Dominican Republic, Ecuador. These are in constituencies with a dictator, so they have zero voting power, or maybe not a dictator. I mean, Belize is not in a constituency with a dictator, but nevertheless has zero voting power. Similarly, China. So we're putting together the two probabilities, the two analyses, the analysis within the board of directors, with all 44 members, we're composing that with the analysis for the constituencies, and the composed voting power index is computed by multiplying together the Penrose indices, which are the swing probabilities, or also known as the Banzhaf measure, I think sometimes. So that's what that diagram is. Table rather. Table. Right, the first column then is the number of votes they've got in the board of directors. The third column is the Banzhaf index, which we've already calculated in the board of governors. And then we've got the composed Penrose index in column 4, and then the composed power percent. So we're taking the multiplied together the Penrose indices times the for the board of directors and for the constituency, and then we've done that for all 48 members, and then normalize them to add to 100. So that's what column 5 is. So this diagram ranks them all by voting. And we can compare, and then in column 6 we have the ranking by this two-stage process. So we're able to see whether countries gain or lose by this voting system, this constituency system. So I think it's quite interesting analysis to do. So that, for example, Peru goes from 14th in terms of its share of the vote to the bottom, 36 equals, because it doesn't have any voting power within its constituency. Likewise, we've probably got United Kingdom there. Yes, United Kingdom is the 16th ranked in terms of its share of the votes, but because it doesn't have the ability to win a vote within the constituency, being dominated always by Japan, it has zero voting power in this two-stage process. It has zero voting power in the board of directors, and likewise there are a number of countries like that. But there's some countries which gain. For example, Switzerland goes from ranked number 22 in terms of its share of the votes to 13 because it gains votes within the constituency, given the structure of the constituency. And also Sweden, I think. Could you move down a little bit, please, scroll down. Thank you. Sweden, yeah, goes from ranked number 32 to number 15 in terms of the two-stage process. And then other countries creep up a bit as well. Some of the countries which gain in the constituency, I think perhaps Netherlands and Belgium, but they fell yeah, 31 to 25. Well, yes. So the various changes anyway that take place here. Yeah, Nicaragua equal 25th, equal 20th. So we can make these comparisons, which will probably be of interest to these countries, because I think in organisations like this, countries are often very jealous of their ranking position, their position in the league tables. So that's the two-stage analysis, the two-stage process. So it's taking a very, very simplistic view that all voting outcomes are equally probable, regardless of the issue and regardless of preferences of the countries. All coalitions are equally likely. So the United Kingdom is just as likely to form a coalition with Venezuela against the United States as the opposite, which is clearly a very empirically untrue statement. This is why it's a priori voting power. It can be justified, I think, from the point of view of designing an institution, from the Rawlsian veil of ignorance argument. Okay, can you put the next slide up? I think it's the same analysis, but ranked this time by the two-stage, the composed voting power analysis. So we can see probably most interesting to look at so maybe it's most interesting to look at the bottom of that table. You can see the countries which are at the bottom with 0 voting power, so they become dummies in the jargon. So they're mostly small countries, small borrowing countries, but a number of large European countries as well as China as well, and Korea, Portugal, and the United Kingdom. Okay, next, I think I'm nearly getting through it. Next slide, please. Yeah, these are the members with 0 voting power within their constituency, and therefore, in terms of the formalities of the constituency voting system, they're powerless. Right, next one, please. These are rules, if anybody's interested, these are rules I had to collect for other regional development banks, and we can compare them, and they're all very different, really. The first one is the Inter-American Development Bank. Then there's the African Development Bank, the Asian Development Bank, and then the more recent creations, the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development, and the Asian, I'm not sure what that's called, I think it's a Chinese bank, but that's a new one. Anyway, these are the voting rules. You can see the complexity there is, and the challenge that there is to developing the algorithms to do the voting power analysis with these kinds of rules. I mean, if you look at the, for example, I mean, ordinary decisions are straightforward. All of them use half the voting weight. That's straightforward. But if you look at things like the rule for removal of a president, you know, the Asian Development Bank needs 2/3 of the members and a half of the voting weight to remove the president, and are to elect the president, and so on. So these are very brief summaries of the rules. I did try to extend the computation, the algorithm I was using for computing. In fact, I tried several algorithms, but it was beyond my powers, I'm afraid. And but it's something that needs to be done. A greater mathematician than me could probably do it. Next slide, please. Next page, please. I think that's the end, really. So my conclusions are: the Board of Governors is very unequal vote distribution, dominated by the USA. In a sense, USA has much larger number of votes than anybody else, and which gives it a lot more voting power than that. It's a property of an unequal voting allocation, with one very large voter, that it becomes more, voting power becomes more unequal for ordinary decisions with a 50% majority. And but for qualified majority decisions, it's more complex. Power is more equally distributed than votes, except for a veto, which is, you know, one country has a veto. And the other thing about a qualified majority decision is that it reduces the power to initiate action. So some votes, although, you know, votes which are below the majority quota do not lead to action. So there is a lack of decisiveness as part of this this kind of design, the voting design, based on supermajorities. Yes, and I've already mentioned that many decisions require both weighted and unweighted majorities in the IADB. They also require numbers from the two types of countries as well. The executive directors are similar results as for the board of directors for ordinary decisions. Voting power is more unequal than voting weight, which is tending to give the United States a greater influence, not surprisingly. And in voting for the executive directors, the constituencies are not defined formally. That's an interesting question to be explored, really. How do the constituencies work, given that they are formally endogenous to the voting process? They're part of the voting process, although the voting rules do restrict the votes that can actually happen. It's a very strange constitution. Right, for the 5 constituencies, we found that in 2 constituencies there was a kind of countervailing power situation with 2 large voters, and this reduced their voting power, as we know. And the beneficiaries of that were Sweden and Switzerland. And yeah, and yeah, I think the three Central South American countries have equal voting power, and we also found in the Central American constituency there was a powerless a voter with a positive number of votes but was powerless, which is interesting. That was Belize, and also in the yeah, I don't think there are any other results. Can you see the next page, please? Yeah. Yeah, and 13 members were found to be entirely powerless. We only needed really, yeah, but we could have, for most of those, we knew that without voting power analysis anyway, because we could have just looked at the numbers. I mean, they're great, and the claim to usefulness of voting power analysis is that it enables you to see things that you can't see. So by by looking at all voting outcomes, you can find occasionally, quite often really, you can find a voter or a group of voters with zero power. So it's useful from the point of view of that, showing that a voter cannot possibly swing an election. I mean, the most famous example of that, of course, was the European Economic Community with 6 members, with Luxembourg. Well, Luxembourg had zero votes in the qualified majority voting system, and I think nobody had noticed. So voting power is useful for finding a kind of finding a situation of zero power. I think it's less useful for finding a distribution of voting power, because it's testing the a priori assumption very much. And of course, what we really need as well is more behavioural power indices. It would be nice to be able to apply voting power, taking into account behaviour, preferences, coalition formation, and so on. And I think some people in this group have done some work on that. Okay, I think that's all I've got to say for the moment. Anyway, thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, Dennis. Any questions, any comments?
Manfred, may I ask a question?
Yes, of course. Fuad Aleskarov.
Dennis, hello again, and thank you very much. So you see, I did several works followed by Dennis' works on different fields. I mean, it was so interesting. So, has it been published, this work, somewhere?
No.
No. Why I am asking, you see, some years ago we did some work on this very two-stage procedures for IMF, and they did not accept it. There were 3 different models I constructed, you see, and they were not accepted by political and how this called, like organizational journals, you see, only on mathematical journals, because we also showed that in IMF, for instance, the over power of the United States, but it is, you see, it's a mathematics. I didn't have any political things in mind, you see. but it wasn't published, you see. So, do you have some kind of working paper of Warwick, for instance?
Well, I wrote this for the bank. They commissioned it. It was so I didn't do it for publication, and but it is published on their website. You can download it from the
From your website, okay.
no, from their website,
From
the
their
bank,
website.
an
Oh, I
American
see.
bank. But it's not. But I
they
haven't submitted it to a journal. I mean, I don't know whether I mean, I don't really need to do that in a way. I'm retired, and but sure. I mean, the two-stage analysis has been published in Public Choice. I have had an article, I think, possibly two, in Public Choice, looking at. I mean, it's useful for understanding coalition formation. The question is it worth joining a coalition? You'll make the coalition, make the group bigger and increase its voting power, but you'll also give up your own voting power. And I did a paper on the UK leaving the European Union, actually, that was published on the LSE website, where I showed that it was Britain would lose power if we left the European Union, because we would leave, the European Union would be smaller with Britain not being in it, and it's the argument is better to be part of a big group, big bloc, than on your own, a small part of a outside the block. So I did that. So I have done various pieces with this model, this discomposed probability.
Oh, I see. Very, very interesting. Very interesting, because we did it also, and concerning these coalitions, you see, I mean, these very indices which take into account coalition formation, we had a series of works. One of them is with Manfred concerning this power distribution in Weimar Republic Parliament. Yeah. Okay. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, and it's really interesting.
Yes,
Dennis, I have a question. I'm a bit worried about the result, that France had, no, Spain had 20% of votes. It was in the middle somewhere, 20% of votes and 40% of voting weights. France had 19% of votes and about 21 of voting weights, just roughly. I mean, this discrepancy. I think, well, this is of course what you get, when you apply this index,
Yes.
And I think, it has also to do with the fact that this discrepancy, that there are so many dummies in this game. You see, I mean, you use the Coleman index, and of course, this is the Coleman index doesn't use minimum winning coalitions. So whenever you have another dummy, you get another coalition, I mean, in this things in this setting. I think there's a problem, I would prefer to see both, that you look at the minimum winning coalitions and then the regular where you just look at the swing players and so on, which is in bands of Coleman or so. Because I think, in this result, I've done several calculations of that sort about 10 years ago, that once you have many dummies, then this difference shows up when you have an index that is not just taking care of minimum winning coalitions.
Yes.
Is that something you looked at, or is it just what
I haven't
nonsense
looked
I
at.
talk?
No. I mean, well, I mean, in this group, there are no dummies. These are all they all have positive. Yeah, I don't know. I haven't looked at that, I'm afraid. But I should do. Clearly, I mean, you know, I should look at the public good index as well.
Hmm. Yeah, well, I didn't want to mention this, but but I mean, it's when I looked at it, you know, for a kind of toy examples, you know, I found, you know, when you have this big differences for minor differences in voting weights, big difference in power index, then this might be due to the fact that you have many dummies. But this is because,
Yeah.
you know, when you use Goldman or Banzer for Shapley Shubik.
Yeah.
Well, this is
Okay.
just an hypothesis.
Yeah. Okay.
Hmm?
Thank you.
Oh, well, nothing to thank. I gave you some work to do.
Yeah. I
Okay.
can't see anybody, by the way. I can just see the paper. I don't know how to. I feel very
Okay.
uneasy about this.
Okay.
Ah,
Klaus Stahl, you had a comment, I think, you know.
Yeah,
Sorry.
yes. Many thanks for the interesting presentation. As you have mentioned yourself already, these this analysis is an a priori analysis in which a Venezuela UK coalition is as likely as an UK US
yes.
coalition. Is could you elaborate a little bit on taking actual preferences, actual voting behavior, actual coalition building into account? Are, for example, the votes in the Inter-American Development Bank made public
Yeah.
to start with?
Yeah. Well, I mean, no, they're not. So it would be a major research project to get any data about the about this particular application or the IMF or something. I mean, when I looked into this for the IMF, I was told, or I learned, that there'd only ever been one contested vote. And I think that had been in the Arab constituency or something, a vote between Egypt and Syria or something. But other than that, everything is decided by consensus, as they say. Even the votes of the executive are determined by consensus. They actually go around the room, apparently asking people what they think, and then they they interpret that as a vote, you know, and they kind of write it down under the table. They don't actually take a tally, which is problematic. But so this is part of the a priori um, um, the a priori framework. But for something like the European Union, I mean, if you want to study voting power in, say, the European Union, then there should be a lot more information about voting votes. I think that perhaps are more open at
I
in
know I
I don't
know
know.
about that. And also about the Council of Ministers. Would it be possible
Yeah,
if data on
I
voting is not available? Sorry for interrupting you. Sometimes I've seen in the political science literature um, an expert view on countries' positions, countries' uh, interests,
yeah,
countries' expected voting behavior. To would that be an opening?
yes, yes, undoubtedly, yes. I mean, there have been. I mean, I've never. Well, I mean, I wrote a paper with Sergei Kanyovsky a few years ago, and he had a method for doing this. So that was published in Public Choice. Yes, I mean, there have been papers. I mean, I haven't really tried to do a lot of research in this. It's something I mean to do, but the problem is that in voting, there's a lot of tactical voting. People say, well, what should I do? And they don't reveal their preferences. So there is a lot of problem, especially when decisions are made by consensus, and of course there's also bargaining to take into account as well, and so on. So it is it's very difficult, but yes, I mean I can't remember. I've seen. There's one paper I remember, but I can't remember the references. I mean, I've not done any work on this for some years, since I've been retired for 6 years, and so I can't really help. But it is an area where we should work, do more work, I think. Yeah.
Thank you.
So I'm sorry, I can't help. But I mean, this kind of thing in a bank, this kind of behind, everything goes on behind the scenes. Things are done by consensus. Often a consensus is claimed when there isn't one, I suspect. I mean, I was once involved. I went to with the G24, which was a group of developing countries, mainly in the IMF. They were lobbying for changes in the IMF voting rules, and they were very very scathing about the claims by the rich countries against the poor countries that they say, well, it's all done by consensus, when it's really not by consensus. Really, it's the powerful countries against the poor countries, So I mean, that is something you could read. I mean, I've got I could recommend some books on the IMF and World Bank, by authors in that tradition as well, from the G24 and from people campaigning for democratization of Bretton Woods institutions. So it's all very much part of the Washington Consensus, isn't it? I mean, yeah, sorry. I've nothing more to say about that for the moment, really, but it's a very large issue.
You want to say something, Manfred? You are muted.
Got the cameras back.
Well, but
again.
for good reason, because I was just about to say something which was nonsense, actually. No, well, my question is whether there are any other questions,
I don't have a real question. Could I ask, or rather present a comment? The idea that there's a tremendous pressure towards consensus in voting bodies, like various banks, as you've been talking about, would suggest to me that it's largely irrelevant to compute power index values, because basically everybody has the same role to play, which is of course slightly provocative. But at least I have been told that the European Economic Community in its beginning, when we had the 6-member, and Luxembourg was a dummy member in that voting body. I think there was very few decisions made by the council involved any kind of vote. They would just observe that there's a consensus, and so even though Luxembourg was basically powerless in terms of power indices, it in fact wasn't. And that probably is the case in many other contexts as well. And that, of course, makes irrelevant my question that I originally planned to present, namely whether your conclusions regarding this development bank would be different if you were using Shapley-Shubik index, which of course is computationally somewhat more complex. But have you made any experiments regarding that, or are you just happy with the bunch of or Lionel Penrose index?
Yes, I'm afraid I don't think that the Shapley-Shubik index really reflects the I don't think it's a good measure of voting power. Actually, I'm in a minority on this, really. But yes, I mean, I did some. My sort of journey to voting power is a bit different from most people, because most people start off with small bodies, 3 or 4 games. Then, whereas I started off with large voting bodies like shareholders in the UK. I mean, companies in public companies on the London Stock Exchange have thousands and thousands of shareholders and very dispersed ownership. And I was very unimpressed by the performance of the Shapley-Shubik index in that context, really, where you can have a company controlled by, say, 30% of the votes, the shares at a company meeting, and that this is sort of well known. This is this is the London Stock Exchange regards a company like that as being controlled.
Okay.
And the Shapley-Shubik index does not pick that up. I mean, the Banzhaf index would be close to 1 for that kind of situation where there's, let's say, one shareholder with, say, 30% of the votes, and then the remaining 70% distributed in smaller pots than that. But when I did the comparison, I mean, I have my programs. I've got algorithms for calculating the Shapley-Shubik indices on my website. You can do the calculations, and I did do them, and I did a comparison using that kind of data. But I found the Shapley-Shubik index was not really showing the kind of responsiveness to concentration of ownership that I thought it should, whereas the Banzhaf index was very sensitive to it.
Okay.
And I think the asymptotic results for oceanic games as well. I don't remember the formula now, but if there's one non-oceanic player, there's one, say, voter with 30%, then, and all the others are in an ocean, let's say, they're all tiny, sort of infinite number, in the limiting case, then I think, as I recall, the Shapley-Shubik index is 30/70. I seem to think in that case. So it would not be 1. It would, and you'd expect it to be. So I think anyway. And I wrote a paper. My paper in political studies. I think it was political studies. It was when Patrick Dunleavy was the editor, and he was interested in voting power. And so that was a paper on shareholder voting, comparing the Shapley-Shubik and the Banzhaf indices. So I don't believe that I think the Shapley-Shubik index is not really sufficient, doesn't really pick up the issue. The voting power analysis is really aimed at. But other people have different views. I mean, I know it's got mathematical, it sort of satisfies the axioms and so on. And the other thing about it is you can't compare. It's very difficult. You can't really, I think, compose it. So you can't have one voting at 2 levels with the Shapley-Shubik index. So partly it's because it would have been impossible to apply in the way I wanted to do, which was to consider the 2 levels of voting.
Okay.
But I'm not convinced by the coalition model either of the Shapley-Shubik index. I think people have got carried away with its mathematical beauty. The original paper by the Shapley value paper.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you very much.
Okay. Not just something to add, because several times we heard about this Luxembourg today. Of course, when you have this rule of 12, I think it was the rule of 12, majority rule, where Italy, France, and Germany had 4 each, and then Belgium and Netherlands had 6, and Luxembourg had 1. And that didn't matter in this case, because you can never be pivotal or whatever, a swing player or so. But of course, it only matters if you apply this rule. But in these days, there was very, very often it was unanimity.
Yeah.
And then we have, of course, the story with consensus. I mean, they didn't vote. They said, well, if there's no objection, then we do it. So this is what we experienced in the political science literature actually of today, or comments. It was not scientific, but there were comments, that the European, or it was EVG, I think at that time, they all agreed. So it depends what rule you apply. I mean, Luxembourg was not a dummy in all cases. It was quite hurt in some cases, actually. I just wanted to add this because it's Christmas very soon, and Luxembourg had this Christmas present, having some power somehow.
Well, Luxembourg is a very rich country.
Yeah, why? Because it's powerful if you have unanimity rule. Yeah, but by the way, I mean, there was this banking law in Luxembourg. I don't know. I mean, this is a long time ago. I looked at it 20 years ago, 30 years ago. And that was very often protected by the case, that there no international influence on this, because Luxembourg, in a way, had a kind of veto in some cases. If you want to have a more serious banking rule, then Luxembourg said no, then in other cases we will veto, and then you will big troubles. But this is just folklore, because I have no data, no nothing on that. It was long time ago, 30 years ago, I guess, or something like that. Yeah. Any other comments? Yeah, then we really make Merry Christmas, and all the best. The 9th of January, we start again with Hanno Vartiainen as a speaker. And yeah, I have nothing to add, but it was a great pleasure, to see some new faces in a way, but well, a bit aging now. Okay. Thank you very much, Dennis. Thank you, Hanno. It was a wonderful introduction. Okay. No, really. I mean,
Yes,
Oh,
very
have you
good.
heard
thank you.
have you heard the introduction last week? That was
No.
terrible. It was me, you know.
Oh,
Terrible.
I
Terrible.
didn't get that impression. I didn't get
That
that
was really good.
impression at
That
all.
was really good, you know. Okay.
Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot.
And happy holidays to everyone.
Holidays. Happy
Bye.
Okay.
holidays.
Bye-bye.
Bye
Thank you.
bye.
Thank you.
You're
Merry Christmas.
bye bye.
Thank you.
Bye.